In the heart of the storm, where the sea roars and the sky darkens, one fisherman's choice to save a drowning man will ignite a battle far beyond the waves. Jim Walker, a man of the ocean, pulls a stranger from the depths, only to discover that the man harbors secrets that could destroy them both. As shadows close in and danger lurks in every corner, their fight for survival becomes a race against time, and against enemies who will stop at nothing to silence them. Who is the man Jim saved? And what are they willing to risk to keep him alive? This is a story of loyalty, courage, and the price of truth. Welcome to TNM. Let's uncover what really happened. In a quiet corner of Crescent Bay, where waves whisper forgotten names and salt air carries echoes of memory, lived a man most had forgotten. His name was Jim Walker, 69 years old. A fisherman by trade, a loner by choice. And, though he never claimed the title, a hero by nature. Jim had no medals displayed on his walls, no photos of family, no accolades. Just the rhythm of the tides, a sturdy wooden boat, and a heart quietly loyal to decency. For nearly 5 decades, the world passed him by, and he asked nothing from it. That is, until the day the sea returned a ghost. A man marked by war, hunted by silence, and burdened with a secret capable of shaking the very core of national security. What follows isn't just a story of survival. It's a testimony to the strength of ordinary men who rise in extraordinary moments. It's about the thin line between betrayal and loyalty, and the price of doing the right thing when nobody is watching. So, what happens when a forgotten fisherman pulls a drowning man from the sea, only to discover the man is a missing naval officer presumed dead for 5 years? The answer lies in stormy nights, whispered oaths, and a sunrise that brings with it not just light, but a black submarine rising from the depths like a ghost answering a silent call. Long before the world would ever hear about a mysterious submarine surfacing in the dawn mist, long before national headlines would whisper of secrets, oaths, and betrayal, there was only Jim Walker. A fisherman, a recluse, and above all, a man of quiet integrity. For 40 years, Jim lived alone by Crescent Bay, where the sky met the sea in a hush of silver and gray. No family, no fame, just tides, nets, and memories. The kind of man most would overlook. The kind of man who becomes invisible in a world that values noise over nuance. Yet, in that obscurity, greatness often hides. On one unassuming autumn afternoon, the kind of day that slips between seasons, Jim made a choice that would ripple across governments, unlock buried truths, and awaken a silent submarine from the depths of history. But let me take you back. Before the conning tower rose from the sea. Before the admiral's salute. Before the headlines. Let me tell you who Jim really was. The wind was beginning to shift. There are mornings when the sea speaks in whispers, murmuring secrets only the old and attuned can understand. That morning, as Jim Walker guided his weather-beaten boat past the mist-laced rocks of Crescent Bay, he sensed something amiss. Not in the sky, though clouds loomed like silent witnesses, but in the water itself, as though the deep was holding its breath. He should have stayed ashore. Any seasoned fisherman would have taken one look at the gray ceiling above and the tremble in the gulls' calls and known a storm was preparing its stage. But Jim wasn't like most. He had spent too many years with only the ocean as his confidant. He had seen the sea angry, wild, vengeful, and he'd survived her moods long enough to grow defiant in his bones. So he went out. The swells were manageable at first. The bay, often a quiet crescent of safety, seemed reluctant to reveal the fury gathering beyond the horizon. Jim cast his nets, his movements efficient, unhurried, and almost reverent, as if offering a humble prayer in the form of muscle memory. Then the tide turned. By mid-afternoon, the winds howled with a ferocity that belied the calm just hours before. Waves crashed against the sides of his modest vessel, tossing it like a child's toy. Jim worked the tiller with iron focus, eyes scanning the horizon for the quickest path home. That's when he saw it. At first, it looked like debris, a dark, erratic shape bobbing between whitecaps. But something in its rhythm felt wrong. It moved not with the tide, but against it, like a creature fighting for life. He squinted. A hand. Instinct overtook hesitation. Jim turned the boat toward the figure, knowing full well what he was risking. Logic had no seat on board now. Only duty. Only the quiet roar inside him that refused to let someone drown alone. As he neared, the figure vanished beneath a frothing wave. Jim's heart clenched. No. Then, 20 yards ahead, the man surfaced again, arms flailing weakly, head barely above the waterline. Jim reached for the life preserver. The man caught it, barely, but couldn't pull himself forward. He was fading. So Jim did the unthinkable. He leapt. The cold was a knife. Not the surface chill one might expect, but the kind that slips beneath the skin and tries to claim your soul. Every joint screamed. Every instinct begged retreat. But Jim didn't stop. He swam with a desperation forged in some long-buried part of himself, the place where old fire still burned. He wrapped his arm around the drowning man's chest and kicked toward the boat. Each wave a mountain, each breath a battle. By miracle or madness, they made it. Jim collapsed on deck beside the unconscious stranger, both men soaked, shivering, and gasping like newly surfaced whales. Rain beat down like punishment. Thunder rolled overhead. But Jim only looked at the man he'd saved. Torn clothing clung to the man's body, revealing a lean build, muscular but gaunt from stress. On his shoulder, beneath the ragged edge of a shredded shirt, a tattoo peeked through, an insignia Jim hadn't seen in decades but recognized instantly. A submarine service tattoo. The man's lips moved. How far, to land? Jim wrapped him in his only blanket. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Hold on. The man nodded faintly, then collapsed. Jim stared out over the water, his boat, a fragile shell in a furious sea. He gripped the tiller and turned toward shore. No prayers left his mouth. But every breath was a promise. Let this man live. Let my strength hold. The storm raged as Jim steered the boat toward shore, his hands gripping the tiller with a desperation that matched the howling winds. Each wave was a reminder of the forces at play, a reminder that he wasn't in control here. He had no more answers. Only a man to save. The stranger lay on the deck, breathing shallowly, his face pale against the drenching rain. Jim glanced at him frequently, the tattoo on his shoulder still haunting him. It was unmistakable, the insignia of a submarine service, one he hadn't seen in over 20 years. It had to be a military tattoo. But why was this man in the water? What had happened to him? And why hadn't Jim heard any word of a missing sailor? The minutes stretched. Every breath Jim took seemed harder than the last. His muscles screamed in protest as he fought the waves and kept the boat steady. The storm wasn't easing. He needed to get them to land before he lost more strength than he could recover. The man stirred faintly, groaning as he shifted on the deck. Jim turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Hey," Jim called out, trying to keep his voice steady against the roar of the storm. "Can you hear me? Stay with me now. We're almost there." The man's lips trembled as he whispered, "Thomas." "Thomas?" Jim repeated, squinting through the rain. "That your name?" The man nodded weakly. His voice, though faint, carried an urgency that chilled Jim's blood. "I need to tell you something about the submarine." Jim didn't ask for more. The last thing he needed was a complicated story. For now, Thomas was alive, and that was all that mattered. Whatever secrets he had, they could wait. As they neared the shore, Jim's mind raced. The bay was a maze of jagged rocks and shifting currents, but he knew it well. His boat was small, but it could handle the terrain. He navigated through the churning waters, his instincts guiding him more than logic. The storm had stripped him of that luxury. Finally, with a desperate push, Jim's boat slid onto the rocky beach, grinding to a halt against the wet stone. He didn't wait for the boat to settle. Without thinking, he lifted Thomas in his arms, carrying him through the surf and onto the sand. The rain was a cold veil that threatened to suffocate them both. But Jim didn't stop. His focus was razor-sharp. He had done what he needed to do. Now it was time for something else. The storm had not relented, but the land was a welcome change. Jim's feet sank into the wet sand as he carried Thomas to higher ground, his back sore, but the adrenaline coursing through him kept his muscles moving. When he reached the shelter of a nearby rock outcrop, he lowered Thomas gently onto the ground, the shivering form still barely conscious. Jim stood over him, eyes scanning the horizon. The storm was relentless, the waves crashing against the shore with a fury that seemed almost personal. Jim felt a pang of unease. The sea was never done. It always took more than you were willing to give. He tore off his wet jacket and draped it over Thomas's body, hoping to stave off the worst of the cold. Thomas was unconscious again. His breathing labored, each rise and fall of his chest a battle. Jim couldn't afford to wait. He needed to know what had happened, needed answers, but for now, all he could do was keep the man alive. The rest would come later. For the next hour, Jim worked feverishly, trying to dry off as much of the wetness from Thomas as he could. He rubbed the stranger's arms, hoping to get the blood flowing. And checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. There was hope. Finally, Thomas stirred again. His eyes fluttered open, but they were clouded with confusion. The fog of fever and exhaustion dulling his usually sharp gaze. Where? His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. You're safe, Jim said, kneeling beside him. You're on land. You're gonna be okay. Thomas tried to sit up, but pain stopped him. He winced, his face contorting in discomfort. The submarine, you have to. Easy, Jim interrupted, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. One thing at a time. Just rest. But Thomas was insistent. His eyes were wide now, searching Jim's face with a clarity that made Jim pause. You don't understand. It wasn't just a storm. Something happened, in the waters. There, after me. Jim's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? The stranger's gaze shifted to the waves beyond. As if the ocean itself had ears and could hear what was coming next. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. When he spoke again, his voice was strained, urgent. They're going to come for you too, he rasped. They won't stop. You can't hide. Jim stood there for a long moment, the weight of those words sinking in. He had always known the ocean was unpredictable. But this was something else entirely. The man was rambling, feverish. He needed help, not paranoia. Still. Jim couldn't shake the unease gnawing at his gut. You're not making sense, Jim said. Who's coming? Who are you talking about? But Thomas didn't answer. His eyes had closed again. And his breath came in shallow gasps. Jim looked around, wondering if he had made a mistake, if he should have just taken the man to the nearest town, gotten him the proper medical care. And left this whole mess behind. But something told him that wasn't an option. Something told him that this story, whatever it was, wasn't over yet. And that the storm had only just begun. The dawn arrived with a thin veil of mist clinging to the hillsides, as if the world had decided to breathe again after the storm. Jim sat by the small fire he'd managed to start. His gaze fixed on the still form of Thomas. The man hadn't moved much in the last few hours, except for the occasional restless shift or the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Jim ran a hand through his weathered hair, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? What had he meant by, "They're after me"? And most pressing of all, why had he been left to die alone in the ocean? The silence between them stretched thin, a palpable thing. The air felt dense, heavy with something unspoken. As though Jim were waiting for Thomas to reveal more than he had already shared. But Thomas didn't wake up, not yet. Jim turned his attention to the horizon. The morning light had started to color the sky in muted oranges and pinks. Despite the beauty, it only reminded him of the storm that had passed, and the one that was still coming. He sighed. Stood up, and walked to the edge of the rocks, where the waves licked hungrily at the shore. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked to be dragged into whatever mess Thomas was tangled up in. But it was too late now. The ocean had already decided. He returned to Thomas's side, noticing that the stranger's breathing had become steadier. Jim leaned down, nudging the man's shoulder gently. Hey, wake up. You're gonna be okay, but I need you to talk to me. It was a few moments before Thomas's eyelids fluttered, and then, with a groan, his eyes opened. The confusion was gone, replaced by something more like clarity and fear. He pushed himself up slightly, grimacing as the pain from his wounds made him wince. You have to listen to me, Thomas rasped, his voice urgent. This isn't over. They're coming. They're closer than you think. Jim's patience was wearing thin. Who's coming after you? Thomas's gaze darted around, as if the very rocks around them might be hiding something, or someone. I can't say too much. But they're military. Highly trained. They've been tracking me for months. And they'll stop at nothing. If they think you're helping me, they'll come for you too. Jim rubbed his face, frustration building. I don't have time for this, man. I saved you. I pulled you from the water. I'm trying to help you, but this sounds like a load of paranoid nonsense. Maybe you need a doctor. Thomas grabbed Jim's arm with surprising strength, his grip tight and desperate. You think I'm paranoid? You think this is just some wild story? His eyes, wild with fear, locked onto Jim's. You have no idea what you're dealing with. They're not just a regular military unit. They're part of something darker. And if they find you, they will never let you go. They won't stop. The rawness in Thomas's voice caught Jim off guard. The man's fear was palpable, almost suffocating. Jim had been around long enough to know when someone was bluffing, and Thomas wasn't bluffing. There was a truth buried deep beneath his words, a truth Jim didn't fully understand yet. But for the first time, Jim felt the heavy weight of the situation. All right, Jim said, taking a step back. I don't know what the hell you're talking about, but I can tell you're not making this up. So here's the deal, I'm gonna help you get back on your feet. But I need answers. No more cryptic talk. No more games. Thomas's eyes softened for a moment, as if considering Jim's words. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll tell you everything, he whispered. But we have to move. Now. Jim didn't hesitate. Whatever Thomas was running from, whatever dangerous force was hot on his heels, Jim knew he couldn't let this man face it alone. Not after what he'd already done. He extended a hand to help Thomas up, and with a final glance at the restless ocean, the two men began to make their way up the rocky incline. The truth, Jim knew, was about to come crashing down on them both. The day was stretching into a golden haze as Jim and Thomas made their way through the dense underbrush that bordered Crescent Bay. The sound of the ocean, once a constant companion, now seemed a distant memory, swallowed up by the forest's quiet embrace. The air had a weight to it, thick with humidity. As if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Jim led the way, navigating through the thicket with practiced ease. Despite the urgency in Thomas's voice, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than he had bargained for. He glanced at Thomas, whose face was etched with lines of pain and fear. The stranger was moving slower now, but he refused to slow down, pushing through the underbrush with a single-minded determination. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, as if checking for an unseen threat. You're not telling me everything, Jim said, his voice low. What's going on? Why are they after you? Thomas didn't answer at first, his jaw tightening as he fought back the pain. But then, as if the weight of the question finally pressed down on him, he spoke. They call it Operation Blackout, Thomas said, his voice rough but steady. It's a covert military project. Highly classified. Only a few know about it. But I was a part of it. Jim stopped in his tracks. He turned to face Thomas, a skeptical frown furrowing his brow. You were in the military? Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. I didn't start in the military. I was a civilian contractor. Worked on communication systems. High-tech stuff. But one day, I was recruited. The project sounded like something out of a dream. They promised the world better security, better surveillance. Everything was in the name of national security. But they had their own agenda. Jim's eyes narrowed. You're telling me this is some government conspiracy? Thomas looked him dead in the eye. Worse. It's not just the government. It's a private military corporation that's above the law. They answer to no one. Jim felt the ground beneath him shift. His instincts screamed at him to walk away from this, to turn back to his simple life on the water. But the man standing before him, broken and desperate, was counting on him. Why did they want you? Jim asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, his hand clutching his side where blood had dried into his shirt. His eyes darkened with regret. I saw something I shouldn't have. Something that would have destroyed everything they were trying to build. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to be part of it. But they can't let anyone walk away from their secrets. Jim stood motionless for a moment, the weight of Thomas's words settling in. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of what the man was saying, but one thing was clear. Whatever Thomas had witnessed, it had been enough to mark him for death. Before he could speak, a sharp rustle in the bushes behind them stopped him cold. Jim's body tensed. His hand instinctively reaching for the small knife strapped to his side. Thomas froze, his eyes wide with fear. They found us, Thomas whispered. Jim didn't wait for another word. He grabbed Thomas's arm and pulled him towards a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. The trees overhead closed in like a canopy, blocking out the fading light of the day. They moved swiftly, knowing that every second counted. Suddenly, there was a crack of a branch, a shadow darting through the trees. Jim's heart pounded in his chest. Whoever was out there was closing in fast. Keep moving. Jim hissed. Don't stop. The forest seemed to close in around them, every sound amplified by the fear that hung thick in the air. Jim's mind raced. Whoever was chasing them was well-trained, methodical. It was no longer a simple matter of survival, they were dealing with something far more dangerous. Another rustle. Closer this time. And then the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the leaves. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he realized just how close they were. The path ahead twisted, leading them up a small hill to a rocky outcrop. Jim knew they needed higher ground, a place where they could see who was pursuing them. But as they reached the top, something else stopped them cold. A figure stood at the edge of the rocks, silhouetted against the setting sun. The figure was tall, wearing a dark military jacket, and holding a rifle. The light reflected off the barrel, casting a cold, menacing glow. Move another step, the figure called, his voice low and deadly, and I'll shoot. Jim's heart raced, but his hand remained steady on the knife. Thomas was beside him. His breathing shallow, his eyes darting back and forth, calculating. Who are you? Jim called out, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The man's lips curled into a smirk. Your worst nightmare. And in that moment, Jim realized just how deep they were in it. There was no way out. The figure standing at the edge of the rocks was as still as a stone, his rifle aimed squarely at them. The late afternoon light cast a ghostly glow over the man's face, revealing nothing but cold intent in his eyes. Jim's mind raced, every instinct he had screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. Not with Thomas at his side. Not with the dangerous secrets lurking in the shadows. For a moment, neither side moved. It was as if time itself had paused. The only sounds the distant crash of waves and the pounding of Jim's heart. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, trying to calculate the next step. They were cornered. Who the hell are you? Jim demanded again, his voice louder this time, a slight edge of defiance creeping in. The man's smirk deepened. I already told you. Your worst nightmare. Thomas, pale and shaking, stepped closer to Jim. This is it, isn't it? His voice was strained, like he was already resigning himself to the inevitable. You don't understand, Jim. These people. They don't leave anything to chance. They'll kill us both. Jim shook his head, the fire inside him igniting. He wasn't going down without a fight. They wouldn't take him. And they sure as hell wouldn't take Thomas either. Don't say that, Jim said firmly. We're not finished yet. The man on the rocks took a step forward, the rifle's barrel following their movements. His eyes flickered briefly to Thomas, a silent acknowledgement of his target. Jim's fingers tightened around the knife. The forest was alive with noise. The wind picking up as if the earth itself was bracing for the storm to come. Jim could almost feel the tension snapping between them like a taut wire. Every step they made toward the edge of the forest was a gamble. "Look, you've got your orders," Jim said, trying to buy them time, "but you don't have to do this. Just let us go. And you can walk away." The man scoffed. "You really think they'll let you walk away after everything you've seen?" There was a sudden flicker in the man's eyes, a shadow of doubt. Jim seized the opportunity. "Who are you working for?" Jim pressed, taking a step forward. The man's gaze darkened, his grip tightening on the rifle. "You don't want to know." "Try me," Jim said. Now moving closer, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Without warning, the man raised the rifle, and for a split second, Jim's life flashed before his eyes. But before the shot could be fired, there was a sharp crack, a loud sound of snapping wood. In an instant, the man collapsed, the rifle falling from his hands. Jim stood frozen, eyes wide, heart thumping. For a brief moment, he couldn't believe what had just happened. Standing a few feet away, a figure emerged from the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in tactical gear. He moved with the precision of someone who had seen combat before, his face obscured by a dark helmet and a black visor. Without hesitation, he approached the fallen figure, checking for signs of life. Then he turned to Jim and Thomas. "Get down," the figure barked, his voice muffled through the helmet. Before Jim could respond, the man's hand shot out, grabbing both of them by the arms and pulling them toward cover. They didn't have time to question who this new player was, the situation was far too dire. The air around them seemed to hum with danger. "Who are you?" Jim asked, trying to steady his breath as they ducked behind a large rock. The figure didn't answer right away, but he glanced over at them. "Not your concern," he muttered. "I'm here to help." A sudden burst of gunfire rang out, echoing through the trees. The man pushed Jim and Thomas further behind the rock, crouching low. The woods around them were alive with movement, soldiers, shadows in the trees, closing in. "Stay down," the man ordered, peering through a small scope attached to his rifle. "I'll handle this." The sounds of battle began to ring in Jim's ears as the man moved with deadly efficiency. It wasn't long before the enemy soldiers began to retreat, disoriented by the unexpected ambush. The air smelled of gunpowder and adrenaline. "Move now," the figure called over his shoulder. "We've got a narrow window. If we stay too long, they'll regroup." Jim grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him up and running toward the dense forest on the other side. The man in tactical gear kept pace, always a few steps ahead, his rifle raised, scanning the terrain for threats. As they ran, Jim's mind was still reeling. Who was this mystery figure? Was he part of Operation Blackout too? Or was he something else altogether, someone who had come to stop it? The dense forest parted ahead of them, and Jim could see the outline of an old cabin in the distance. It was hidden, tucked away like a forgotten relic of some other time. There was a glimmer of hope in the way it stood in the fading light, like a sanctuary. They reached the cabin just as the sounds of pursuit started to fade. The mystery man turned to face Jim and Thomas, his expression unreadable behind the visor. "This is where I leave you," he said simply. Jim opened his mouth to protest, but the man cut him off. "You're on your own from here. But don't make the mistake of thinking you're safe. Not yet." Before Jim could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the trees as silently as he had arrived. Jim watched him vanish, a question hanging in the air between them. He turned to Thomas, who was already looking at him, his face pale but determined. "What now?" Thomas asked quietly. Jim glanced toward the cabin, then back to the path they had just taken. He didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear, the fight wasn't over yet. And now, more than ever, the truth was the only weapon they had left. A year later, the sea was calm again. Jim Walker stood on the docks of Crescent Bay, the scent of salt and diesel in the air, his hands resting on a small, wooden box. Inside it, neatly folded, were Thomas's dog tags, a silver compass, and a weathered photograph of the submarine crew, young, proud, full of fire. It was the only thing Thomas had asked Jim to keep before he dove one last time into the depths. No one else knew what truly happened down there. To the world. Thomas McAllister was declared missing in action, then presumed dead. But Jim knew. The Navy didn't press for details, and Jim didn't volunteer any. That morning, he boarded his boat. Just like always. But this time, he wasn't going out to fish. He sailed out to the point where the water turned deep, where the sonar had once failed, where the past had surfaced. He opened the box, kissed the photograph, and gently tipped its contents into the sea. The dog tags sank slowly, spiraling, caught in a column of golden light. Jim saluted as they disappeared below. Rest easy, sailor. Mission complete. Then he turned the boat homeward, the horizon wide and endless ahead. The waves parted gently, not with silence this time, but with peace.